right. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. On behalf of the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown University, let me extend a warm welcome to you all for this installment of the Georgetown on the Hill event series. I am Ferdinando Monte. I'm an associate professor of economics at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Moderating this debate with me will be Anna Maria Maida, who is a professor of economics at the Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Economics Department, also at Georgetown University. The schedule for today is going to be pretty simple. We're going to have a half an hour discussion among all of us, and after that, we will turn the microphone and the word to you for a formal question and answer session. And after that, what I'm sure is going to be an engaging discussion, we can continue the conversation over refreshments, and I do encourage you to reach out to our speakers to continue the debate. Which brings me to today's topic, which is understanding the present and charting the future for US immigration. Immigration shapes national economies and local economies in profound ways. Across industries, immigrants contribute to innovation, productivity, generating new opportunities for growth, and solidifying American intellectual and technological leadership. Yet, any immigration policy may have dramatically different impacts across education groups, across occupations, across regions. And so the policy discussions around this are very important. And we feel very lucky today to have a stellar panel of guests guiding us through an exploration of these topics. So let me give the word to Anna Maria to introduce our panel and kick off the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ferdinando. Let me first introduce Giovanni. Giovanni Peri is the Brian Cameron Distinguished Professor in International Economics at University of California, Davis, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Giovanni has conducted extensive research on the impact of international migration on labor markets and productivity in receiving countries, on the determinants of international migration, and on the evaluation of policies for the integration of migrants and refugees. Next, Ronald Hira is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University and a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute. Ronald's work intersects STEM's labor markets, immigration, globalization, and competitiveness policy. Ronald is also the author of Outsourcing America, which was one of the first books to examine the economic and policy implications of the offshoring of high-skilled jobs. And finally, Teresa Cardinal Brown is a senior advisor for immigration and border policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She has been director of immigration and border policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and associate director of business immigration advocacy at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. She has extensive policy experience and has served in different capacities at the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection under the Bush and Obama administration. Thank you very much for coming. Let me start with the first question to Giovanni. Giovanni, you have worked extensively on the economics of immigration. My first question to you is, what have we learned about international migration and the economic impact of international migration in the last 20 years?
Yes, thank you, Anna Maria. Thank you, Ferdinando. Thank you for coming. It's great to be here. So I'm going to start my consideration by talking about what immigration is and has been in the United States, a little bit in numbers, right? I am an economist and I work a lot with economists and demographer, and I think a picture of what immigration has been in the last 24 years, from 2000 to 2024 in the US, is very helpful to start having the right picture. So in these 24 years, the number of immigrant or foreign-born in the US has grown by about 15 millions in 24 years. That's the net growth. Out of these 15 millions, one thing that economists always emphasize, 10 millions of immigrants who have come in are college graduates or more. And 5 million are people who don't have college degrees. So if you look at the inflow of immigrants in the last 24 years in the US, a very large number of people with high education skills, which work, as I will say in a second, in healthcare, in technology, in business, in innovation, have been foreign born. So this has contributed to employment in the US. Employment in the US has grown by 6% because of immigrants. How have these immigrants done, and who are these immigrants? So the biggest countries of immigration in these 24 years are India, Mexico, and China, in order of size. So in this period, the largest inflows have been from these three countries, and many more from others. And maybe you already have an intuition, the type of immigrants from these three countries are different. A lot of Indian are college educated working as professional. Chinese group is more mixed, I would say half and a half. Mexican are more coming as non-college educated working in more manual type of jobs. How have these immigrants done in the economy of the US? Well, most study of the American economy see that all of these immigrants, with some variation, but all of these immigrants, by 10 years since they have come in the United States, have an employment rate, so they work at a rate which is larger than American, 5 to 10% more. So they are more likely to be employed, and then depending on what group and what skill they have, they are employed in different areas. But the ability to integrate in the economy of US immigrants has been extraordinary, especially if, as I do, you compare this with what happens in Europe, what has happened in Europe. In Europe, the integration rate is much slower in the labor market and is much smaller. Now, what have been the impact of immigration, of this big immigration, of this composite group of people into the American economy? That's been the focus of my studies in most areas. And I would say that this 25 years of immigration that have increased immigrant by 6%, of course have contributed 6% of employment. These people are working. But also, they have meant much more demand for American goods and services, many more firms which have started. Immigrants are entrepreneurs, founder of firms at a much higher rate, 3 times higher than Americans. So firms, more investment, more capital, more demand, and larger economy. And the estimate says that they have contributed another 6% to American GDP through all these effects of more investment, more demand, more innovation, more technology. 6% of the American GDP that more immigrants have generated for all Americans, for other Americans, is $1.6 trillion, okay? Those are big numbers, big contribution of immigrants in the US. Now, let me say one thing about much more recent immigration. So a lot of the focus, once you look at this number, you say, how come we have heard a lot about immigration in 2022, 2023, the mass of people coming through the border. So 2022 and 2023 were unusual years in terms of how many people came through the border. And technically, they didn't come as undocumented. They came as protected status, asylum seeker, most of them, parole, humanitarian parole. They may become undocumented if this decision are rescinded. But these 2-3 millions is the number that has come in 2022-23. But I want to point at one important economic condition under which this more recent immigrants have come in. The US labor market has been in an extraordinary situation since 2020, which has never experienced before. And this situation is that since 2020, since the rebound from COVID, the number of unfilled vacancies, unfilled jobs in the United States in 2021, 22, 23, 24, and now, the number of unfilled vacancies has been larger and sometimes much larger than the number of unemployed in the US. Meaning that the US has had a problem in filling the jobs that it has created in the last 4 years. In 2021, there were 15 millions of open vacancies, 15 millions, and about 7 millions of unemployed. So there were a full 8 millions of unfilled jobs. Then the labor market has adjusted, and now there are 7.5 million of vacancies, unfilled job, and a little bit less than 7 million of unemployed. So still like this. Why is this? Because the United States labor force, population in working age since 2020, for the first time in the history of the US, the US-born labor force is declining. The US labor force has been growing at a rate of 1 million persons per year in the 90s, in the 2000s. Since 2020, after COVID, it has lost, the US labor force, about 500,000 workers, US-born workers per year. So there are a lot of jobs that are losing these people, and they are harder to fill. And this has continued for the last 5 years and is projected to become much worse because the big baby boomer generation is retiring. This shortage of workers is going to become larger and larger. And so what is the consequence on the labor market? And the interesting thing, and then I will stop, that I will say is that a lot of the sectors that have found a harder time to fill these vacancies because these workers are declining are sectors that employed not the non-college educated, the less educated. They are home services, construction services, hospitality, home care, health care in the part of assistance of people. These are sector, just the hospitality sector today, if you go, has 1.5 million of vacancies of unfilled jobs. Just the healthcare and social support, so assistance of elderly disabled, has 1 million open vacancies as of now. These are numbers that denote a tightness and a lack of ability of the US to fill jobs, and that 2 million of people who entered, I agree, they entered in 22-23 chaotically, in a way that is problematic, in a way that we don't want people to enter. That's wrong. But they still, although they enter in this way, they found employment, most of them, because the labor market so desperately needs some of these people. So to conclude, the situation of the US is that of the last 25 years that the US has benefited in GDP per capita, in investment, in total GDP and in employment by immigrants in large part. The US has come in a situation in which there is a declining of the labor force, of the native labor force. There are more jobs than people that will do it. And in the longer run, a lot of this decision that we will make on immigration will have important impact on how the economy of the United States and how the labor market of the United States will evolve. And I'm going to stop here because that's where we are today, just as a first picture of the situation.
Giovanni, thank you so much for this bird's eye view of what has happened so far and where we are today. Ronil, one of the things that Giovanni alluded to is the preponderance of high-skilled immigration in the last 20 years in the US. You are an expert at this. You worked a lot. Would you like to tell us a little more about what the facts are and where the policy stands?
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Monti. Pleased to be here. So I'm going to focus on my research, which is on skilled immigration. When I mean by skilled, the definition is people with a 4-year college degree. And what's interesting that a lot of people don't realize is that even though we have a lot of discussion around skilled immigration, US skilled immigration, the reality is there's almost no immigration involved in US skilled immigration. It's almost entirely guest worker programs. And just to put some numbers around it to get a sense of the scale of guest workers versus actual immigration, there's about 1.5 million skilled, that means college educated, guest workers in the program, in the country working, and there's only about 60,000 employment-based green cards for those skilled workers. So you've got 1.5 million guest workers chasing 60,000 green cards each year, which means that there's 25 guest workers for every single permanent immigration, every green card. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. The most important is that guest workers are guests. They have limited rights. They have limited employment rights. And whether you're talking about skilled guest workers or lesser skilled guest workers, whether you're talking about the US or the United Arab Emirates that relies on a lot of guest worker programs, putting those workers in that lower leverage and lower bargaining and fewer employment rights creates problems for them because they're not able to bargain for what their competitive wage would be. It also has spillover detrimental effects on US workers who compete against those guest workers. Secondly, every guest worker program requires its own regulatory regime. And so you need to create a bureaucracy, you need to create separate rules for those guest worker programs, and then you have to ensure that there's compliance around those rules. And that never really happens. And so that's where you have opportunities for problems. So let me drill into the best known of the skilled guest worker programs, something called the H-1B program. And it's called the H-1B because that's where it is in the code. It's paragraph H, subparagraph 1, subparagraph B, where this is defined. So this is for people with bachelor's degrees. There was a big discussion over Christmas time. You may have missed it, where Elon Musk and Steve Bannon were going after one another about the H-1B program. But what was missed in a lot of that coverage is that this is not just a inside Republican or inside the MAGA debate. There's also debates within the Democrats, too. So you had Bernie Sanders come out and criticize the H-1B program, as he has for many years. So let me talk about the H-1B program because it's not well understood. The H-1B program has nothing to do with shortages, with workforce shortages. There's nothing in the law and the rules and the compliance that requires an employer to show that there's a shortage of US workers before hiring an H-1B worker. There's nothing in the rules or law that requires the employer to pay H-1B workers market wages. They can be paid less than market wages. And the employer controls the worker's living status, the legal status here. So the worker doesn't have portability, doesn't control the visa, and their legal status, the employer controls it. That gives them huge amounts of bargaining leverage over the H-1B worker that they don't get over US workers who would, if they didn't like the wages and working conditions, would leave. And H-1B workers can replace US workers. This is legal and this happens quite frequently. And the leading H-1B employer, Cognizant Technology, which got 180,000 H-1B workers over approvals over a decade, was just found in federal court to be guilty of using the H-1B program for employment discrimination, so racial discrimination, and favoring H-1B workers there. The second sort of important thing about the H-1B program is it has nothing to do with merit or competence. So you're not bringing in the best and brightest. There's nothing in the rules that require the workers to be the best and brightest. The eligibility criteria is really pretty low. It's anybody with a bachelor's degree for virtually any white-collar occupation. And we have a system where the selection process is not selecting the best H-1B applicants, but we use a random lottery system. So imagine a major university like Georgetown University getting, 40,000 applications, and instead of selecting the 1,500 undergrads, freshmen that they want to bring in, just running a random lottery on the 40,000 applicants. That's how we run the H-1B program. So you have this poor selection process. It really has nothing to do with merit or competence. The workers are not bringing in special skills. They're ordinary workers, mostly. Now, there are some very specialized skills. And that's important because that's just one program, the H-1B. There's the L1, the O1, the P1, the TN. There's this whole alphabet soup and the OPT of these skilled guest worker programs, and they have even fewer protections than the H-1B program. So I'll leave it at that, but I think those are kind of important things. Let's make the distinction between guest worker programs. If we're talking about immigration, we should be talking about actual immigration and not guest workers.
Thank you very much, Ronald. And next, I would like to ask a question to Teresa. You have nearly 30 years of experience in immigration policy and legislation. So I would like to ask you to talk about the policy proposals related to immigration and the legislation related to workers as far as immigration is concerned, and what have been the challenges in this work.
Well, thank you very much, Anna Maria and Georgetown for inviting me. So let's talk about what our current immigration system is and where it came from. The basic immigration law, the bulk of the immigration law was created in 1965. It was the legal immigration system, particularly the employment-based legal immigration system, was last significantly updated in 1990. So the H-1B category was created in 1990. There have been minor changes to the legal immigration system in a few narrow contexts since then, but by and large, our immigration system is more than 30 years old. So let's just put the pin in that. Lots has changed in our country in 30 years, but our immigration system has not. And even though Congress has attempted in various ways to pass broader immigration bills, narrower immigration bills, cut deals on one side or the other, under presidents of both parties, under majorities of both parties in Congress. It has been very, very difficult. So what this has meant is that presidents of both parties who want to see changes in immigration, who find it difficult to get Congress to agree on that, have been themselves putting forward new regulations or reinterpreting existing law or trying to press their discretionary authorities, which are granted in certain aspects in immigration law, pretty much to the edge of the envelope, and sometimes some would argue beyond. And what that has resulted in is a lot of litigation. And so going back to like President Obama, he was sued over the DACA program he created for immigrants who came to the United States as children, granting them work authorization and protection from deportation when Congress wasn't able to legislate. President Trump in his first term was sued over many of his policies. Some succeeded, some didn't. President Biden came in, switched a lot of those executive orders around 180 degrees, and he was in turn sued. And some of those lawsuits were successful and some were not. And here we are again with lots of litigation in the first 100 days of this administration, a lot of it around immigration. Why does this matter? Well, it matters in that even though the immigration does give some discretion to the presidents, the basic structure, how many immigrants can come in, how many temporary workers can come in, the categories, the requirements for those categories are set in statute. And the president cannot really change that. So what you find is the presidents are using narrower discretionary policies in the immigration law to kind of create new programs that Congress isn't doing. So there's definitely pressure on the system. The discrepancy between temporary workers, guest workers, if you want to call that, or green cards, that's part of our 1965 law. And it was intentional because there's a difference of opinion, and probably in this room, about whether we want people to come and work for a period of time and go home and not add to the total population of the country, or we want people to come and add to the total population of the country. And so our system created temporary programs that were truly temporary and green cards that were truly green cards and didn't line them up at all. Made it very difficult to go from one to the other. Then we have just sort of the overall politics and policy of immigration, which is trying to balance a lot of different interests. At its core, immigration is about how we let people in, who we should let people in, and those categories. So there's a lot of discussion now and always has been about legal immigration versus illegal immigration, right? One of the things that Giovanni will probably tell you is that because our legal immigration system is limited by Congress and because enforcement of immigration laws has varied over time, and we can talk about what that means, when we have more job openings in the United States, illegal immigration increases. Just, you can look at the charts, it absolutely happens. People go around the system if they find it too restrictive and if there's jobs that they can have. We also have this dichotomy between temporary immigration and permanent immigration. Which should we want, particularly if we're talking about economic immigrants? But we also have a system that, if you just look at the green cards, more than 2/3 of our green cards are not for employment. They are based on family relationships or humanitarian causes. That was intentional. But there are a lot of people who say, should we change that? Should we have a system that is more based on economic needs? I will tell you that a primarily family-based immigration system makes us different from most other developed countries in the world and how they structure their immigration systems, which tend to prioritize economic-based migration. You know, we've talked a lot about humanitarian migration, asylum seekers over the last several years. Everyone talks about asylum seekers at the border. In general, we do have a humanitarian program, but many people who are using the humanitarian program would probably enjoy an employment-based visa if that was available to them or if they thought they could qualify. So you have these dichotomies. Where I think the future is going to go is the system is going to continue to have pressure on it. It's going to continue to have pressure on it from immigration that's happening around the existing rules. It's going to continue to have pressure on it based on the demographic changes that the United States is seeing and the need for a different workforce as our workforce is aging. We're going to have pressure on the system to say, okay, if we want to have more immigration, what should it look like? Should it be mostly temporary? Should it be permanent? How do we create a system if the bureaucratic enforcement mechanisms built into the system aren't really working? What might work better? Those should all be decisions made here in Congress. Because those are, by definition, political decisions of balancing interests, and this is the place that's supposed to happen. When you have presidents and executive branch officials by decree making very big changes in our immigration system that by definition are not permanent because only legislation is permanent, then we have wild swings of policy from one administration to another, and that's what we've seen. And that creates more chaos in the system overall. And frankly, most Americans, if you get outside of DC and talk to them, will go, wherever we land, can we just get rid of the chaos? Americans are allergic to chaotic systems, and right now, that's how they feel about a lot of our immigration system. So I would argue that, if you ask me today, who's making immigration policy for the United States, I would say it's our courts. So a president will issue a slew of executive orders, and then one day a court will enjoin or restrain that order, and then the next court in the appeal will overturn that and say, okay, policy's back on. Next court, policy's back off. Well, it's temporarily off, but then later we decide it can be back on. But wait a minute, it's all off again. Again, chaos in the system. And the cracks of this 30-year-old system are not only showing, they are breaking wide open. So my hope is that we can look at all of these policy issues and have really important and valid discussions about what our future immigration should be, but that they should happen here in Congress. And to be very clear about this, I work at a place called the Bipartisan Policy Center. That's not just an idea because it's nice. Each party has had full control of Washington more than once in the last 20 years. And neither party has successfully gotten their preferred version of immigration done. We are now in a position where every 2 years something's going to change, we probably know that, and the margins are small. And what you've seen is that neither party, honestly, can get all of its own party in line, as Ronnie was saying. So the only way it's going to get done is on a bipartisan basis. And that means that no party is going to get everything they want, everybody's going to get something, but we can't sit in this stalemate because our immigration is going to happen, and it's going to happen in ways that we're not entirely comfortable with until we readdress it.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you very much. Let me now go back to Giovanni. You gave us a very nice overview of the findings of the academic literature on migration, and we know that in the last 3 months, several executive orders have been signed. Can you use the findings of those studies to tell us what you expect to be the economic impacts of these executive orders?
Yes, thank you. So this is a hard question because, as Teresa said, immigration policies should be done through Congress change, which are more thought through, more permanent, more impactful. While in the most of the last decades, but in these last 3 months in particular, they are done through executive orders. So the uncertainty of how much of what is in the executive order will become operational depends on the courts, depends on how implementable they are. But let me try to give a flavor of what I think these 3 months, where they are directing us these 3 months relative to what we had before. So there has been a sequence of order, but I will organize them of executive into 3 groups. One group that mostly affect the humanitarian immigration, the undocumented immigrant, how hard it is to enter for people who are asylum seekers. These orders and sort of more expedited deportation, stopping, closing the border, revoking temporary protective status, all this will affect immigrants who are probably of a low high school education and less, so that group of immigrants that does more manual physical jobs that I told you are becoming extremely scarce in this economy. Then there is a group of executive order that probably will affect instead the high-skilled workers. So this sort of executive order towards university, limiting the funding, targeting some students, making it harder for students to get a visa, making it more cumbersome. This will probably reduce the number of students. So even if this executive order, some are stopped, they have already generated a little bit of anxiety among the students who can come. And international students can go to Canada, they can go to Australia, they can go to Europe instead. So even if some of these effects are still uncertain, they have created big anxiety. And then there is a group that may even affect the second generation immigrant, the birth right citizenship, which could eliminate it. So I would say that taken together, I think that we try to put some estimate around the number of immigrants that this could reduce, how much it will reduce. And actually, in a study that we produced recently, we estimate that maybe the set of executive order on low skill will generate a net decline of foreign immigrant without a college degree by 400,000 per year, and a fewer immigrant with college degree by 200,000 per year. These are measures that are just estimate and that are just likely to happen if this executive orders stay. And these are still relatively small numbers, right? It will take a while before affecting the stock of immigrants, but minus 600,000 people in working age that we're losing every year. And remember, the US labor force is shrinking at the rate of 500,000 people every year. So every year we will have 1 million fewer workers, out of which half without a college degree and half with a college degree, for filling jobs that then will likely generate a shrinking of the economy. So we calculated that maybe this will cost close to $200 billion every year to the US, close to 600,000 jobs, close to a decline in even productivity and GDP per capita through fewer investment, fewer specialization, fewer innovation of maybe 0.3% every year. So those are effects that can happen. I want to say three other things which are important that will be affected. Number one, the economy is becoming much more older. There are many more retirees, and these retirees will drive a lot of economic growth in the future. They will demand the services and goods, and they will be at even harder time. So the aging will generate an even further problem in filling jobs as in healthcare, in home care assistance, in food provision for this part of the population. Number two, a lot of these immigrants that provide local services provide a relief to families and to many times to women in families who do this type of jobs of assisting the elderly, assisting the kids. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that when more immigrants are available and more of these services are available, women are more likely to participate into the labor force, not to have to take care of their older people. So they're parents. So this is also sort of an equity type of reason, or at least the impact will be in large part on those groups. Finally, some sector will see such an increase in such a decrease in worker that the cost of providing these services will increase. So maybe sectors like construction, as I said, maybe healthcare will experience increase in a little bit of an increase in wages because workers need to be found and need to be brought in, but certainly an increase in prices also because it becomes more costly to fill this area. And ultimately, the loss of all this number of people and all this productivity will also mean loss of fiscal revenue for the US. So as much as the idea is that immigrants are a weight on society in terms of fiscal redistribution, the evidence of this is much more balanced in a sense. Immigrants contribute a lot, and in particular the immigration that we have had with many high skilled has contributed, and so maybe this shrinking of the local economies and of the aggregate economy also will cost to the United States a few billions in tax revenue every every year in the next few years. But I want to emphasize how the uncertainty now is what prevails. I've given you a number that takes some prediction and puts some average on what we have observed. We will need at least to wait 1 year to see what's the actual effect of these policies on the flows of people who come in, on the type of people who come in, on people who are sent back. How many of the people who are here will be repatriated, will live on their own because of the environment. And so we should monitor, continue to monitor, but certainly given the initial picture that I gave you, I think the current situation puts an even further compression and risk of reducing inflow of immigration to level which will actually damage the economy of the US in the long run.
Thank you, Giovanni. Ronil, Giovanni has painted a picture in which the supply of immigrants is reducing, either directly because of restrictions or because uncertainty slows down the flows. On the other hand, we live in a world in which technological innovation is moving at a breakneck pace. We have the whole artificial intelligence arms race going on. So where do you see, how do you see firms trying to meet their demand for their skilled workers? And perhaps a little bit for Teresa as well, what do you think is the room for policy, for Congress to sort of meet that imbalance in the labor market?
Yeah, so if you look at demand measures, the real demand measure you would look for in terms of the equilibrium supply and demand would be prices. And in this case, if you're talking about labor, it's wages. And so if you look at software wages, which I just did last night, just to make sure I'm on top of it, they've been flat for computer and math occupations. That does not indicate any kind of shortage, right? If you have a shortage of eggs, what happens? The egg prices go up. Everybody hates that, right? Well, when you have a shortage of software workers, employers have to pay more, right? That's good for the software workers. The employers will complain and the like. But the reality is that they're bringing in these workers, guest workers, at record numbers at the same time that they're laying off tens of thousands of workers. So I've done some comparisons. These are top firms, Google, Microsoft, laying off tens of thousands of workers while still importing H-1B workers at record numbers and OPT. So I think we have to be careful about looking and trying to count jobs that way without looking at least wages. And I'm very skeptical of the job vacancy data. I don't think that quality of those data are very good because you don't know how persistent, how much effort that the employers are making with the vacancies. The JOLTS data is not very good and not very granular. So I think that one of the insights that economists have is that the economy adjusts, right? I mean, this is the whole idea behind prices, is that they adjust supply and demand. So when supply outstrips demand, then prices drop, wages drop. When demand outstrips supply, wages go up. But employers will adjust in other ways too, by investing in automation. They're of course offshoring like crazy too. In many of these skilled jobs, there was just a story recently about petroleum engineering being offshored to my cousins in India, who make about $10,000 a year, which is a good salary there for an engineer. And we've got stories, at least in the short run, and I'm careful about this in terms of trying to look at unemployment data and in the short run, but where kids are graduating with computer science degrees because they've been convinced that there's all this great future in technology and computer science jobs, and they're having a very difficult time finding positions. So I think we just have to be careful about trying to micromanage. I mean, that's why you have to create the right kinds of incentives around pricing and bringing in guest workers. If the guest workers were really filling shortages, that would be a positive thing. But right now you have a flood of guest workers going into markets that have no need for them, that could be easily filled by U.S. workers.
Teresa, what is your view on
I think I'll just say I agree with Giovanni that we're in a very big period of uncertainty, not just about what of the immigration changes of this administration we're going to stick, what of the tariff changes of this administration are going to stick. These are not unrelated things. One of the stated goals of the Trump administration with the imposition of tariffs is to reshore many of the industries that have gone to lower wage countries or have been offshored partly for companies to figure out a way to increase profits, but just reconstruct the entire international trading system. Well, if he's successful and we do suddenly recreate textile manufacturing in the United States, I would very much think it's not going to look like the textile manufacturing that exists in the United States 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. It's going to be mostly automated. And so is that going to be jobs that will be recreated in the United States? Hard to say, but the technology may not appreciably make the cost of that product lower for Americans than what we have right now by importing, to be seen. But even if, say, there are advanced manufacturing jobs that he hopes to create, where are the workers to fill them? To Ron's point, many of us and our children have been convinced over the years that you need to get a 4-year degree. And yet the jobs that are most at risk from automation right now, particularly AI, are the 4-year jobs. And we have a lot of people for whom their parents were in manufacturing and the parents didn't want their kids in manufacturing. So who is going to go say, yes, I'm going to sign up to do this job? We have a demographic issue. We have other issues. And that workforce component hasn't yet been kind of talked about a lot. It's magically it will happen. I would say that the challenge of all of this is that we don't know what the economy is going to do. We don't know all the ways that employers are going to change in response to the current policies. We don't know all the way immigrants are going to respond to the current policies. We don't know all the ways Americans are going to respond to the current policies. And so that uncertainty makes it a hard environment. I would suggest very strongly that that's one of the reasons why our immigration system should be less static, right? We should be able to adapt. Changes in other policies may impact what kinds of workers we want to see or what kinds of immigrants could be helpful. Changes in other things around the world certainly have created a lot of the migration that we've seen over the last 10 years. Things that are not necessarily directly related to what's happening in the United States, certainly not necessarily related to our policies, but a lot related to just massive displacement around the world for lots of different reasons. So when we have a system that has not been technically updated in more than 30 years, we have all of these changes, we create more uncertainty. So some ways that Congress could address this is by looking at the changes that we think are needed now, but look at the changes we think might be needed 5 or 10 years from now, and then revisit. I mean, Congress is just afraid right now, many members will look at, they're afraid to vote the wrong way on immigration, and wrong way is dependent on where you sit and a lot of things, but they're just afraid to take that vote. But what that means is that we're not actually improving anything. The issues that Ron may have, the issues that Giovanni may have with the existing system aren't being changed fundamentally. They're not being addressed. So if Congress was willing to legislate and then revisit it in a few years and go, you know what, we thought that people and the economy would respond this way, and they haven't, so maybe we need to tweak something and do something different. We used to pass in this country between 1990, say, and 2000, 2004, we passed on average 1 to 2 immigration bills a year, most of them small. The really big comprehensive bills that you've probably heard about didn't succeed. But we made tweaks to the system on a semi-regular basis that we just seem not to be able to do now. So I do think that the uncertainty now and the certainty that another administration will do something different and create more uncertainty should be driving a refocus on what can Congress do and what should Congress do.
Ronald, it seems like you have, if you can take 1 minute and then I want.
I'll be brief. So I agree with the bigger picture that on the larger changes in immigration, the numbers and things like that needs to be done by Congress. But there's a lot of things that can be done through rulemaking on the executive branch. And in fact, President Trump had introduced a number of reforms to the H-1B program that would have raised the wages for H-1B workers so that they were closer to market wages and would have changed the equation from an employer employer looking at it, do I hire a U.S. worker at market wage or do I hire a cheaper indentured H-1B worker? No brainer, right? They're after profit. They're going to go after the cheaper H-1B worker. That can be fixed in rulemaking, and we know what the rules are. The Biden administration chose not to introduce those rules and maintain them, and the new Trump 47 administration has not introduced, but we know what those rules are, so it doesn't actually need an act of Congress to fix a lot of the flaws that I mentioned in the H-1B.
My response to that would be, you're correct, things can be done by regulation, but in a period of time where any incoming administration, their first act is to undo regulations of the previous administration, for the most part. Again, it's not permanent change. It's more permanent than an executive order.
Well, it's better than the current system.
But it's not permanent. It's not permanent change.
Well,
Or longer
I
term.
feel a little bit bittersweet because I knew the discussion was going to be engaging, but I also broke the promise to the audience to give them 20 minutes for Q&A. So let me perhaps take a little more than 5-6 minutes to hear from your questions, and then the conversation can continue later.
Thank you so much. I'm a psychiatrist, and now I'm naturalized citizen. Came to United States 15 years ago from Pakistan, and there are about 20% of U.S. physicians are immigrants. So most of you might have a doctor who was immigrant with that percentage. So right now that, and many came from all over the world. One issue, if I was back home now and thinking of coming to US, I will be very reluctant with all this uncertainty. But also, if somebody wants to come, in 2015 there was a Muslim ban legislation. One of the things that got court decided not to go through with that because it was religious discrimination. So now there is a new travel ban in proposition on a different name of which countries' visas can be vetted. But that's everybody's seeing the same countries that were in the previous list are in this list, and any day now, a new executive order might come based on that. So this is creating a lot of uncertainty, even more in many people from those countries, and with all the potential. And I know there are over 500,000 Muslim doctors in US right now. So if this is just one field. Of course, they're in every different field. So on this promoting of Islamophobia and religious discrimination, this has just worsened so much more problems. And people who are here, they're afraid to travel, that if they would travel back home, can they enter back? And we could disagree, we could have disagreements, but for having a different opinion or freedom of speech, that should not be taken away. Even people who are naturalized citizens or green card holders, they are nervous here. So I would love to hear your opinion on this matter.
I will say that, to Giovanni's point earlier, the United States has benefited greatly from this position of being the place that everybody wanted to come, right? Ronald Reagan talked very much about the city on the hill. George W. Bush talked about, we should be glad that people want to come to the United States. That means that we've been successful. That means we're a place people want to come. That should make us proud. And to the extent that, whether it's the current administration's policies or just the uncertainty of policies, people are deciding that maybe the United States is not that place anymore. That will have ongoing implications for the future of immigration to the United States, regardless of what our policies are, right? Our policies are one aspect of immigration. But what I like to say is that long before anyone looks at what our actual policies are to come to the United States, they have decided they want to come to the United States. That's the first decision. And if that changes, if people decide, nope, you know what, I don't even want to try to come to the United States, that will have implications for our future. And how we respond as a country to that, how our economy responds, what that will mean in terms of our society at large is to be determined. But we did see some of that during the first Trump administration. Immigration to the United States did decline, permanent immigration and temporary immigration, in part because of changes the administration did. COVID then supercharged that, right? No one was going anywhere in the first couple of years of COVID, regardless of what the policies were. And we saw, what that meant. There were definitely fluctuations in our economy. Now, our economy was also under stress at that same time. If we have a growing economy and we have fewer immigrants willing to come, what will that look like? And I think, again, these will be changes that will happen regardless of the policies in place, because the first decision is of the immigrant to decide whether or not they want to come to the United States.
I want to say a thing about physicians, sorry, because I have been studying physician and it's a very important area. The US has a massive demand for physicians, and in some location, very few American will go. A lot of physicians have come to the US. The visa is not the only barrier. You need a medical school degree, which is compatible with the US, and you need a residence, which is compatible. So that creates another
Residence
hurdle.
has to be in the US.
In the US. So those is why the medical profession is problematic. There is a recent study, very interesting, that shows that hospitals which are associated to university and as a consequence don't have the cap on the H-1B visa program that they have, so they can hire foreign physicians without the cap, that instead private hospitals who are subject to the cap that cannot are hiring many more foreign physicians, many more American physicians. They have a ratio of physician hour to bed which is much lower, so physicians are less overworked, and they have some health outcome for their patients which is significantly better. We need to find a way, absolutely, to allow this, and the current environment for sure will drastically cut the number of physicians that come to the United States, because as you say, many fewer will come, and there will be consequences of this. I have no doubt that there will be fewer of them coming in the next couple of years, and then we will see the consequence in the following couple of years.
Could you guys say anything on religious discrimination piece of it? I know religion is a taboo topic.
I mean, what I will say is that in the first Trump administration, what was called the Muslim ban, the travel ban, whatever you want to call it, went through 3 iterations before the final version was allowed by the Supreme Court. And the first 2 iterations were, for the most part, deemed discriminatory on religious grounds, which is technically prohibited in our immigration law. The 3rd iteration focused on, as you said, vetting, information sharing. Are these countries that are providing sufficient information to the United States government for us to do a thorough vetting of immigrants who want to come to the United States? That is the rationale, that is the stated rationale, and the courts look at that and say that understanding national security implications is a purview of the executive branch, and so if that is the facial reason, regardless of whatever disparate impact it may have, that is a valid reason, and that's what the Supreme Court said. So if you look at what the Trump administration put forward this time around, it started there. It didn't start where it did in the first administration. Does that mean there's discriminatory animus underlying it? Quite possibly, and I'm sure there will be litigation arguing that, but at least right now, I would say the courts are giving, on national security grounds, particularly foreign policy grounds, they are giving more deference to the executive branch. In other areas, they're giving less deference. So for example, the Supreme Court overturned a decision called Chevron, in a decision last year called Loper-Bright, for legal geeks in the audience. Up until that decision last year, courts were told they had to give deference to the government's interpretation of a statute when that statute was unclear. The reversal of that last year said, actually, courts need to examine it on their own. The government is entitled to no special deference, so the judges have the requirement, the obligation to weigh the arguments of the plaintiffs and the government as to which interpretation might be correct. So in certain areas, the government is given more deference. In other areas, the government is given less deference. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you that our immigration system is absolutely neutral or absent any discrimination. The very first law that the United States passed regarding immigration to restrict it was Chinese exclusion. No Chinese nationals could come to the United States, and for more than 100 years, no Chinese citizen could become an American. So clearly, there's racial, our history is full of that. But where we are today, the courts try to interpret the law in as neutral a way as possible. What that means at the end of the day is who comes to the United States and who wants to come to the United States is going to depend again on the decisions of individuals as much as what our policy is.
Thank you. There is one question. If you promise me, it's going to be a 1 minute, and if you all promise me, it's going to be 1 minute, and then.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. My name is Nina. I'm a Hubert Humphrey Fellow at American University. My question is regarding specific group of migrants, those in need of international protection. And with the recent decisions of suspension of resettlement program, it has really devastating effect for humanitarian sector in general. Refugees, asylum seekers in general very often are considered as powerless people, as burden to the society. So my question is, it's really difficult to talk about morality. It's very relative, and to encourage society to welcome refugees from the moral perspective. But it's important to talk with numbers and with facts. So I was just wondering if you have any data specifically regarding refugees, asylum seekers, how they are contributing to the economy, and is there something that we can really use in public discussions to sort of motivate people to welcome refugees in the U.S.?
1 minute.
1 minute. So I am a part of a National Academy of Science study on the integration of refugees in the United States, and this will turn into a book a year from now, of which I am writing chapter 4, which is the economic integration of refugees. I'm going to tell you a couple of things that I know, and then you'll have to wait for that, but that will be, sounds like a very good tool for you to look at. Refugees in the United States, which we have tracked since the first big wave that we can consider, which was the wave of Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Laotian in 1975 on, have had a rate of integration in employment, in income, in housing ownership, which has been, by the 10th or 15th year they were in the US, they had caught up with the Americans, starting from very disadvantaged condition. And this has been true for then the refugee from Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe in later period, and also for what we can see for the Syrian, with a little bit of, that have come much more recently. The Afghani group is a little bit starting a little bit further back, but it seems to be also integrating and converging. And so looking at this number, at this data, I would say that the experience of the US in integrating refugees specifically is extraordinary, because the refugee integration in Europe, for instance, which is in many respects, has put more policies trying to help them, has put more investment, is much worse on economic outcome. They have been kept out of employment for a longer time. In the US, I think the general rule is that immigrant and refugee come to work and come to integrate in the labor market and to contribute to the society. Of course, we need to improve rules, but that has been something that applies to refugees. So read the book when it comes out.
If I can just real quick, you put refugees and asylum seekers together. Legally, there is a distinction, and I think we need to recognize that. A refugee is somebody who has been determined to have been persecuted or well-founded persecution on account of outside the United States and brought to the United States by the US government, and that entitles them to certain supportive services, at least for a period of time. Asylum seekers are people who come to the United States and after arriving then asked for those protections. They have not been determined yet to be a refugee until they go through that process. And I think one of the challenges to our existing refugee resettlement system has been the arrival of all the asylum seekers. Because until this recent period, refugee resettlement was a bipartisan priority. There really wasn't a lot of significant sort of bipartisan animosity toward refugee resettlement per se. There were things that Congress said about certain priorities we should have and who we should, but the arrival of the asylum seekers kind of blurred that support in many ways because, one, the volume was so large. Two, it seemed that these were people that were coming and we couldn't know whether or not they really were truly refugees until some process played out, and the process kept getting longer and longer because more people kept getting into it. And so we had, several million people in the United States who we didn't know yet whether or not they really were people who deserved that protection or not. So it really, when it bogged down the process we had created in 1980 to decide this, it created a pushback among many Americans to say, wait a minute, you know, yes, we feel we should help humanitarian causes and we should help people, but we should understand who's coming. And so I think we have this problem right now that because of the challenges that the arrivals and the asylum seekers have had, it has undermined political support for the refugee program writ large. So you heard this administration for the first time saying, because right now we have each administration sets the number of refugees we want to resettle, but there's no cap on the number of asylum grants that we can give each year. So if 3 million people come and ask for asylum and we decide that all 3 million are deserving, there's nothing in our law that says that that's a problem, that's allowed. This administration for the first time said, no, you know what, we should look at the total numbers of both. And one of the reasons they pulled back on refugee resettlement is because they said we have all these asylum seekers. That is a new phenomenon from a policy perspective, and I think that is what we have to grapple to the extent that the United States and people still want to preserve and protect the system of international protection for those most deserving of it. We need to find a way to square that a little bit so that people can feel that, yes, we really are helping those who deserve it, and we have a functional way to adjudicate that.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I'm going to conclude. Ferdinand and I would like to thank Giovanni, Teresa, and Ronil for a very interesting conversation, and we're going to open it to lunch.
Lunch.
Thank
And
you
please
very
do
much. You
continue
haven't
the
already been
conversation with
eating.
us.